on major international and global themes. The topic of our gathering this year, food security, disruption of the global food supply chains, its impact on global security, should be read in this perspective. The event of the last few years with the outbreak of COVID pandemics, the war in Ukraine, the threat to the country of major maritime routes have caused huge suffering for the entire population, especially in Africa. Sharp increase in the price of basic cereals, the shortage in food supplies, and other matters will have long-lasting effects on the stability, the security, the public health of many countries and regions. Hunger today is not merely the absence of food, but the breakdown of the chain that brings food to people, the supply chain. Food security is therefore not only an agricultural issue, but one of peace, stability, and human dignity. Where food is lacking or becomes inaccessible, forced migration, social conflicts, radicalization, and structural dependence on aid increase. In this context, the role of the Order of Malta is distinctive and, I would say, strategic. The Order operates at the point of intersection between emergency response and development, between immediate assistance and the rebuilding of local capacities. Not only the distribution of food in time of crisis, but also support for microagriculture and local supply chain, nutritional program linked to healthcare and maternity, protection of the most vulnerable communities, dialogue with government and institutional, thanks to its diplomatic network. Among the most recent initiatives of the Order of Malta in this broad area, I would like to briefly recall a major program currently underway in Lebanon, where the Order of Malta provides selected services to farmers with a significant and crucial financial support from the German government. Again, with the support of the German government and the operation of Malteser International, its worldwide relief agency, the Order has supplied more than 200 tons of fresh food to a community of around 25,000 people in Gaza City under extremely difficult circumstances in the second half of 2024. In a world where the food chain is increasingly fragile, the Order of Malta reminds us that the food security is inseparable from human security. The increase in food production and productivity certainly requires big investment, public and private as well. However, this goal cannot be achieved without the continuity and the reliability of the public partnership made possible by development aid, particularly with those coming from the States. I wish to thank again our distinguished speakers and panelists, as well as all of you. Thank you very much.
We now invite Alexander De Croo, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme and former Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Belgium, to make his statement. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and I first would like to thank the Sovereign Order of Malta and MSC Munich Security Conference for organizing this side event. More than ever today, in a world where security is very high on the agenda, where instability has an impact on everyone, we see that the real fault lines are not just drawn on a map. It is not so much only borders, it is not so much only military battalions. What we see is that the real fault lines are very often systems. It's energy systems, it's societal systems, and it is food systems. And these underlying systems are very often the lifelines of society. This is how societies are organized. This is also how societies are destabilized today. We know that there is more instability now than 5 years ago, and that is reflected in the number of people who are in a situation of acute food insecurity. Today, it is 345 million people. In 2019, it was half of that. And so the number of people in acute in food insecurity is just a symptom of the underlying instability that we see. Out of these 345 million, there are 1.6 million in Gaza today. 80% of the population in Gaza is in a risk of acute food insecurity. And that food insecurity is not something which is in isolation. We used to look at food insecurity as a humanitarian issue and something that needs to be dealt with by, for example, humanitarian organizations. This is not the case anymore at all. It is a reflection of regional, national, and very often also global insecurity and instability. We also see that hunger is not just spreading through the stomach. It is not just a problem of hunger anymore. It destabilizes society in a fundamental way. It leads to refugee streams, which has a huge impact on the stability of regions, and it impacts markets, it impacts political tensions, and so on. And we have seen this. I mean, when the Ukraine war started years ago, the impact on food system throughout the world is something that actually opened the eyes of many people. And we also saw what the impact of, for example, a pandemic such as COVID was. Today, you could actually say that food insecurity is a leading driver of instability in the world. When we see food insecurity emerging, you can almost, like in a textbook, know that other instability and other tensions is going to build up. Which means that food insecurity is not so much something we have to deal with, but something we have to prevent. And this whole prevention approach basically demands a systemic look. It is not so much just supplying food, it is not so much working on the emergency side, it is much more on building resilience, building societal resilience, building food systems which are part of a general economic resilience. And there, a multilateral approach matters. If you want to strengthen the resilience of societies, it is obviously linked to food policy, it is linked to agricultural policy, but it is not so much linked to building societies, to building governance, and so on. And there I believe that the UN system, in the multitude of angles that we take, going from expertise organization on agriculture and on food systems, to humanitarian organizations and to system integrators such as UNDP, we really have a very important role to play. The discussion that we have here today, and I really would like to thank again for convening this and putting this topic at the center. You could think that it is about hunger, and you could think it is about food, but actually it is about resilience and how from multiple angles you build resilience. It's building food resilience, but in the end, it is about building resilient societies. So thank you for organizing this, and really looking forward to a great panel discussion that will take place.
We shall now listen to Álvaro Lario Hervás, President of the United Nations International Fund for Agriculture Development, Scene Setting. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Grand Chancellor, for convening us today, to the Sovereign Order of Malta, for your welcome. And I'm really delighted to be here today. We're hearing a lot of friends in the room from our sister agencies, RBAs, to UN agencies specialized on migration, on development on a systemic basis, also science with CJR. So I think clearly it's good that we're coming from many different angles, as Alexander was mentioning, linking humanitarian and development, trying to also see what are the root causes of conflict and hunger and how they drive one each other, and bringing opportunity and hope and livelihoods. And this is what I will be trying to convey. Strong food systems underpin stable societies, well-functioning economies, and peace between countries, but also across regions. When these fail, pressure builds up quietly before it erupts into conflict, forced displacement, forced migration, and instability. Food insecurity accelerates competition over land and water, drives forced migration, and weakens state legitimacy. And that's why food security and farmers, for us, belong at the center of the discussions on global stability. My one message for today is that security is not possible without food security. For almost 50 years, IFAD has been investing in this first mile, creating jobs, addressing the root causes of poverty and hunger, and really investing where food is being produced, but also processed, transported, exported. And many of these investments actually are driving growth, are creating jobs, are building resilience. It's investing in the livelihoods. Almost more than 1/3 of our portfolio currently is in fragile and conflict settings. And this is only increasing. At our recent Governing Council with our 180 member states, we're hearing more and more ministers of foreign affairs, of finance, of agriculture, talking about food security as national security, talking about food self-sufficiency, about creating jobs for a young population whereby in agriculture there's more than 50–60% of the population that is employed in many cases formally and informally. So it really builds social cohesion, and this is where stability is really being built. For us, let me show some examples of when rural households produce food, earn an income, and access markets, how do they stabilize communities. An example in Central Sudan, where they have limited access to land and water, and which has led to disputes between farmers and herders, sometimes violent, in a violent manner. Livestock resilience program marked out the animal routes, established community-led management committees between farmers and herders, set up conflict resolution centers, and all of that has been made that many of the disputes were resolved before they escalated. So now, in many of these communities, herders and farmers can peacefully coexist. Also, as another message that it's important, and we all talk about the private sector, in the case of IFAD, we are starting to co-invest, using our balance sheet being a financial institution, using guarantees, using the local financial institutions to really mobilize more funds to this first mile. An example in Nigeria, we invest in a private sector company, Babangona, who's supporting farmers, 650,000 rural people, on fertilizer, seeds, financial services, market access, and that has helped them increase their yields, their income, and therefore being an important source also of investment at a time where we know that development budgets are becoming also more constraints, and also public budgets are becoming constraints. So let me finalize saying that, as many of you will be hearing today, food security sits at the heart of economic and political stability. When rural economies weaken, we also see that this ripple effect has ripple effects beyond the national borders. So by underinvestment in many of these food systems, the only and main consequence will be that we will end up paying more on humanitarian and on crisis response. So food security is not simply about feeding the people today, it's also about reducing the likelihood of conflict tomorrow. Simply put, we cannot afford not to invest in food security. Thank you very much.
We now look forward listening to Dr. Maximo Torero Cullen, Chief Economist of Food and Agriculture Organization, Deep Dive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Order of Malta and to the Munich Security Council for being able to present today the situation that we are facing. So what I'm trying to do today is to bring this relationship that has been heard already. Food security is happiness, is security. Lack of food security is sadness, but it's also conflict, migration, and lack of security. And that's that interrelationship, we need to have it very clearly today. So let me start by bringing some of the context and the numbers which are so important. We already have heard about acute food insecurity, but also chronic food insecurity, chronic undernourishment. We have 673 million people that are undernourished, and more than 2 billion people that don't have access to a healthy diet. So those numbers are crucial. But what is also extremely important is to understand what is happening in terms of food inflation in the world. Why it matters? It matters because of political stability. It matters because of macroeconomic stability. It matters because food security and nutrition is affected. And we know today that in terms of political stability, 46 to 80% of voters consider food price as a decisive factor in their election. In macroeconomic stability, 60% of countries' food products represent 25% of their CPI basket, the Consumer Price Index basket. And food security and nutrition, it has the most vulnerable because the people who consume and spend most of the budget in food are the poorest people, and that's the relationship with conflict. And what we have been observing is this relationship. The orange line is the level of food price index, inflation, food inflation. The blue line is the consumer, the overall consumer price index. And what is unexpected is that the food inflation is going faster and steeper than the consumer overall inflation. And this is a big challenge. Now, we are talking of food. We are not talking of the commodities. So wheat, maize, the commodity price varies different, but food requires energy, requires labor force, requires water. That's why the proportion of the input of the commodity is not so big when we talk about food. So that's the interrelationship with the other sectors. So when we have an energy crisis, we are affecting food, and we need to understand that. If we look at the evolution of the commodity prices, which is the light blue line, you will see that it has been affected by many shocks. COVID-19, which exacerbated the situation with the recovery, and then we have the war in Ukraine, which even exacerbated even more the situation, especially on the inputs market. Prices were increased by 4 times of input prices, which affect the future, affect the tomorrow. But also, of course, we have shocks, climatic shocks, which are going to increase in frequency and intensity. And there is no doubt about it. That is going to happen no matter what we do today. The intensity and frequency of climate shocks will increase. Could be 10 years, 20 years from now, that will start to reduce if we do the correct things. But in the next 10 years, we know that is going to happen. But on the other hand, you see that this yellow line, the food inflation, continues to grow. So we need to tackle this problem, and we need to take into account all these interdependencies. Why? Because if we look by income levels, you will see in the top, low-income countries. Those are the ones that have the biggest challenge. Their food inflation is even higher than the higher-income countries because they have less tools. And they are also affected by exchange rate. So it's not only the price effect of the commodity, of the food, which they import mostly, but it's also the effect of the exchange rate. If the currency is weak, their central banks are weak, that will also impact the food import bill. Now, colleagues, why we face this challenge of food inflation? There are demand factors, there are supply factors, there are factors which are imported, and there is monetary creation, which is something that has happened. So we see first that in the demand side, governments expanded 17 trillion in fiscal support to overcome COVID-19. That creates a huge impact in demand. The supply, on the other hand, was affected by COVID-19, the disruption of global value chains. It was also affected by the input prices, but also by extreme weather events. So you have an expansion in demand and a reduction of supply. Result of that, price will go up. And then we have, of course, appreciation of the dollar, as I mentioned before, and monetary creation to recover from COVID-19. So all those points needs to be looked at it. But in addition to that, today, we are also facing other types of impacts. Impact on output and input prices because of volatility, impact on trade flows, impact on food import bill and export revenues, and impact on economic growth and exchange rate, as I mentioned before. Trade has become a geopolitical variable. And what we observe, and I won't go in detail in this dense slide, but it's important to understand that when we talk about trade and we put trade changes and trade constraints, there are several levels of effects. In blue, you have the ones that we know for certain will happen. In orange, you have the ones that we don't know too much. In red is the ones that we have a lot of uncertainties because it depends on responses from other countries and interactions. But clearly, the first round effects will be immediate and we are already feeling them. But again, it's not clear that this will bring more revenue to the governments. It's not clear if this will affect investments in the future. And of course, it will affect the second round effects. But which clearly we don't know is that we could affect investments in the future. And that for sure will put us in a second optimal situation. We are automizing the trade. It's no longer one global trade spaghetti ball. It's a segmented trade spaghetti ball, and it will continue to be segmented. Today, we take 24 hours to do trade agreements. 1 year, 2 years ago, we took a year and a half, because we did a lot of assessments when we do those agreements. We are losing that assessment to see what will impact and how will affect the future. And what is the consequence of this? The consequence is that trade is increasingly shaped by geopolitics. Comparative advantages, which is what is behind trade, is lost. Supply chains are shifting from just in time to just in case. We are thinking different on how to identify our supply inputs. It's just in case. That's a big shift that creates fragmented global value chains, affects our economic fundamental decisions, and of course will create some bilateral tensions in the future. Let me just bring one more element in this presentation, which is 3 major risks that are super important. I'm very happy CGIAR is here and CIMIT, because we are going to face biological threats and the spread of animal crop diseases. And this is not just my national security, this is the transboundary security. That's where the linkages happen. It's not just to be secure in my country, because diseases can fly, can move. And if I protect my borders, they can move informally, even worse, I cannot control them. One example of that is the soybean Asian rust, which is already in many countries of the world. The second one is the nuclear threats. If I contaminate land by nuclear residuals, I lose the land for 10 years or more. That's it, it's out of business. And third, logistical threats that we have seen already. These diseases are extremely important, and we ran these simulations for this meeting especially, as a request of the Malta government, to see what are the impacts of this on our baskets and on the way we produce. And these are some of the numbers that come out on these global simulations. The soybean Asian rust scenario, which is basically affecting productivity, 30% of yield loss in temperate climate, 50% of yield loss in tropical climate. The impact is $59 to $54 billion annual losses of real income of the world. In the left-hand side, you see how consumption will be affected, moving again totally to starchy foods instead of proteins, which is what compose a healthy diet. The exports will also be affected negatively, and food prices, of course, will be relatively affected. And in the right-hand side, you see the distribution by countries, so the heterogeneous effects across countries. Huge impact of something that today is happening, to which we need to be prepared, to which we need to bring solutions. The second example is the example of disruption in trade routes. In the left-hand side, you have the trade routes of today and how much time it takes. In the right-hand side, you see what happened between October 2023 and January 2024. See how the shift of the trade routes because of some geopolitical issues. That immediately increased the cost. And today, we are operating at a higher level of cost, which were different to before COVID-19. And those higher level makes it that I can have some flexibility, but I am being third or fourth optimal in terms of allocation of the resources. Now, what will be the monetary impact of a disruption in the Panama and the Suez Canal? 91 to 95 billion annual losses of real income for the world. And specifically to food, it will be 18 to 19 billion of annual losses linked to food trade. So, colleagues, the impacts are huge, the interrelations are huge. And yes, we need to be resilient, but we need to be resilient to avoid this to happen, not to wait until it happens and scale up. That's what we call act in anticipation. Resilience has two components: the components of preventive, early warning systems, One Health approach, having all these transparent disease control systems in place. And it has the second component, is capacity of absorption. How much me as a country can absorb a shock because the shocks will happen. If I have better early anticipatory action, I will reduce that need of being anticipatory. But if not, I also need to be anticipatory. I have to invest in creating new varieties. I have to invest in research and development because I need to protect our farmers and what we produce to avoid those diseases to be tackling them. And that's the huge validity of our gene banks, because they bring our biodiversity to protect what could change. The same applies for GMOs. GMOs are identical. If a disease affects to them, we wipe off all the soybeans in the world in 1 second. We need to have options ready to be able to cope with that. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to be with you.
We will now show you a movie on the Order of Malta.
Every day, in every corner of the world, there are people who need help. People who are suffering, who are struggling for their health, who are seeking a better future for themselves and for their children. For almost 1,000 years, the Order of Malta has stood beside them. This has continued until this day. Today, in over 130 countries around the world, we are present with refugee shelters, medical centers, social health programs, emergency intervention, and educational projects. We provide drinking water and food. We assist those who do not have access to care. We accompany those who live in solitude and need. We welcome those fleeing war. We offer psychological support to those who need it. We bring aid to places affected by earthquakes, catastrophes, and other calamities. Every gesture of care, every outstretched hand is an act of dignity and of hope. There's a story behind every face we encounter. And in this story, there's a place for all who believe in the dignity of life and the power of solidarity. So that no one is left behind.
Now we may invite Ismahin Elouafi, Executive Managing Director of the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, to moderate a panel discussion with Amy Pope, Director General of the International Organization for Migration, Karl Skau, Deputy Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of the World Food Programme, and again Dr. Maximo Torrero-Cullen, Chief Economist of FAO. Thank you.
So good morning, colleagues. I think the scene has been very well set for us. We have heard some key messages from the Chancellor that talk from the heart on behalf of Order of Malta of the need really to help those that needs it the most. From the Secretary General of UNDP that said food insecurity it's a leading driver for instability, and reminded us of countries like Palestine or Gaza, where 80% of the people are food insecure, to Alvaro Lario, that reminded us it's the right investment to make. We can't keep it going the way it is. We need more investment, and that investment has to be in those rural communities that need it the most. And to Maximo, that gave us really numbers that shows it's not only about hunger, it's about diseases. And it's not only about conflict, it's also climate change that could induce climate, and how it impacts both the global north and the global south. The food index and the instability, it's affecting all of us. But it affects the least income countries much more than any. So thank you so much for all the speakers, but particularly Alvaro Lario and also Maximo that set the scene for this panel. I'm Ismahin Elouafi. I'm the Executive Managing Director of CGR, which stands for Consultative Group for International Agriculture Research. And that's the largest publicly funded international agriculture research that actually produce innovations so that we can start the transformation of our food, land, and water systems. So at CGR, we cover about 70 countries, of course, with a focus on least income countries, and looking mostly at major commodities like wheat, maize, like rice, and many more, but also animals and fish, and the landscape where they are growing, so water, land. And I like very much, Maximo, thank you for talking about contamination of land, because once you contaminate the land, it requires decades to really get decontaminated and could be produced. So what we heard is that today, more than ever, we do need to come together. We need to recognize that food security, it's a national security, it's a global security. We heard as well that we need innovation to speed up the development. We can't go at the same pace we have been going for the last century. We need to speed it up. As global tension rise, the link between food security and national security becomes even clearer. Conflict fuels hunger, and hunger fuels conflict. So when debates focus narrowly on military defense, we ignore the fact that food security is a pillar of global security and a strategic investment. It's not nice to have, it's a must-have, and it's very strategic. So today's discussion, and already the panelists were introduced, will focus on strengthening local production, reinforcing long-term resilience in food system, and addressing the funding gaps that leave the most vulnerable region increasingly exposed. Those gaps that carry growing implications for global stability and security. So I have the pleasure to start with you, Amy. And the question, Amy, is how does rising food insecurity translate into migration pressures and regional instability? And what are the security implications for affected countries, both the origin and where they move to? How can the resilience of food system be effectively enhanced to help prevent instability and the risk of displacement?
Well, thank you so much. And first, a very warm thank you to the Sovereign Order of Malta, who has been an important partner in humanitarian response around the world, and to the Grand Chancellor himself for his advocacy and personal, tireless support for people who are in need. I'm actually quite delighted to be here representing the International Organization for Migration in a conversation about food. We know migration is dominating the headlines in almost every single country all around the world, and the conversation tends to focus on how do we manage borders, how do we manage the crossing of people across the sea or across deserts, and we don't actually have as much of a conversation about what drives people to move in the first place. And until we start to talk about those drivers of migration, we won't be able to solve the problem of irregular migration. So let's start with food, because that's at the heart of why often people migrate. It is one of the greatest factors that lead people to leave in the first place. And it's often an indicator of an upcoming famine. It makes sense, right? We all know it. If you cannot feed yourself, if you cannot feed your children, it's normal, it's human to move in search of food. So if we do not connect the dots between ensuring people have the food they need, we will never get our arms around the issue of migration. Now, there's a flip side of it. Migration also can be a way to address food insecurity. Right? On the one side, people are leaving because they don't have sufficient food, because many communities, including in Africa, are heavily reliant on agriculture. We see with the impact of extreme weather and climate shocks, more and more people cannot raise the food they need to feed themselves and their families. But on the flip side, for many migrants around the world, their remittances coming back home create some more security around food. Likewise, migrants are often the backbone of agricultural production around the world. We see it in the country that I'm from, the United States. We see it across Europe, but it's not limited just to the United States and Europe. We see it across Africa. We see it across Asia. We see it across Latin America. So recognizing this connectivity, addressing food security as a driver of migration will be critical to coming up with meaningful solutions around irregular migration that every country is dealing with.
Thank you very much, Amy, and you really reinforce what we heard before. So it could be a driver, the food insecurity for migration. One time I read about how long a refugee stays or displaced people stays in every place, and I was struck by how long it is. Do you want to tell us more about it?
Yeah, so two things to put on the table. First is, unfortunately, many people who are fleeing insecurity, food insecurity, will not qualify as refugees. So they will not have the protections that refugees are entitled to under conventions. They're treated effectively as economic migrants. So that's an important factor when we're thinking about what are the range of solutions. But the second is we know that displaced communities are now staying longer and longer in situations of displacement. And we tend to stop the conversation about making sure they have enough food in order to survive. And that's where Carl and his team are coming in. But if we continue to rely just on providing food aid, and we don't move to how people can be the agents of their own food production, we will be left in a situation of protracted dependence on food assistance. And so it's critical that we factor in this issue of displacement so we enable people to have dignity and agency and a better future.
Thank you so much, and that's a really good segue to talk more about the local production, a little bit on the supply chain in those conflict zones. So I go to you, Carl. From a security perspective, how can stronger local food production in fragile states reduce vulnerability to shocks and instability? And what coordinated action are needed to protect global food supply chain as a matter of international security?
Thank you, and thank you really for bringing us together on this important topic this morning. There has been a lot of talk about how food security impacts on stability and national security. And I thought I'd just illustrate a little bit from a few contexts, what we see on the front lines. Right now, Somalia is hit by a serious drought. All the indicators are going in the wrong directions. And what we then also see is increasing tensions between herders and farmers throughout the country. And so we're seeing conflicts erupting in places we haven't seen before. And obviously groups like Al-Shabaab is taking advantage on this and is expanding their presence and leverage. In the Sahel, serious cuts in food assistance over the past couple of years, again, combined with a demographic with a lot of young people, a lot of young men, who are now joining jihadist groups, and we're seeing increasing challenges in Niger, in Burkina, in Mali, on those national governments holding security in their countries. And this, of course, also has an impact on Europe in terms of criminality and other flow-over effects. In Haiti, we're seeing more young people join groups because they have nowhere else to turn. In Sudan, I can speak a long time about Sudan, but where we have seen over the past couple of years really examples of using food as a weapon of war, certainly as a weapon of leverage, with first El Fasher being closed off for any assistance or food coming in, and now a similar situation in the south of Cordovan. If I turn it around, in Syria, there is an opportunity for a transition, but we're not investing enough in basic services and basic food safety, so that we change the sense of people's suffering. Because if they don't feel that change is there, that's also going to have an impact on them supporting this political transition that the international community is supporting. And finally, on Gaza, again, lots to say on Gaza, but I think what happened there over the past couple of years in terms of experimenting, including with whatever we want to call it, food aid ways of doing business. It's really cracked the social fabric. I've been 6 times to Gaza during this war. And my latest visit a couple of weeks ago, it's clear that this is a society that has been severely damaged, its foundation. And the way that food has been managed through this crisis is at the core of that cracking. And so to rebuild or to recover or to restart, that's also going to be essential. Clearly, food assistance is not the solution. What we do is to damage control. It's to avoid the worst. Yeah. But what is needed is investment in food system at the local level, at the national level, and at the global level. And this is where we need to come together in not only working together as UN agencies or development humanitarian agencies, but really governments, private sector, and all the stakeholders that can change the trajectory at all levels. I think from WFP's point of view, we have really made a shift. Our strategic plan that was adopted at the end of last year by our board has that at the center. We need to focus, we need to integrate, and working with others. But if there's one appeal also sitting on this panel to governments, it is that, well, one, keep this high on the agenda. I mean, having watched the discussions here in Munich over the years, it feels like the kind of soft, if you want to call them that, elements of security is coming down, the hards are coming up. So, an appeal to keep food security high on the agenda and bring attention to how closely it is linked to security, whether in Africa, the Middle East, or in Ukraine. And then on funding, of course. We have seen a massive drop in our contributions that is really putting strains. And it's not only the level of funding, it's also how funding is provided. We see more earmarking, and we frankly see, while we talk about bringing development and humanitarian together, that's certainly what we want to do, those of us who are engaged in delivering programs and solutions. The funding streams are coming apart, with the bank, with the Commission, others turning to more traditional development, and some humanitarian donors kind of moving back 20, 30 years, talking about pure humanitarian assistance that is only life-saving. So, rather than coming together and providing those integrated solutions, we are, in a way, being pulled apart at this moment.
Which is very unfortunate, given really the maturity where we are in multilateralism. You would think we should have been continuing to develop stronger ties, working together instead of separating. But Carl, weaponization of food that happens either in the Sahel, as you mentioned it, or in Gaza, or in Ukraine war as well, it's really very difficult. So where do you see innovation when you talk about local production or overbuilding systems? And I like very much what Alexander said. So the failure is the failure of systems, energy systems, food systems. And again, Maximo really showed us that it's not only about commodities. The food is beyond really the production. It's the whole value chain. So where do you see innovation? You are talking about Yemen, Gaza, and many other places. Do you think it's realistic to think about local production in Somalia or Sudan or others that you mentioned?
No, for sure. I mean, in Somalia, all we've been doing over these past few years is really to invest in resilience, to find solutions for self-reliance, to invest in climate adaptation. But it's not been enough, of course, because what we're now seeing, again, is Somalia being hit by a drought. What we also have learned in Somalia is that when we see these indicators, if we invest early in what we call anticipatory action, in prevention, disaster can be prevented. But right now, we don't have those flexible resources early on to do that. So we are kind of screaming out there that, if we invest now, it's going to be not only saving lives, but a lot of money, rather than to come when, the disaster has hit. So Sudan, we are procuring 75% of the assistance that we have provided in those crisis parts of Sudan, Darfur, Kordofan. We have procured inside Sudan, in those areas that are still productive. So I think that's one way for us to ensure that also in our humanitarian assistance, we do procurement as close as possible to where the crisis is hit, because that's a way of strengthening locally the food systems. We're also turning to cash as far as we can. Wherever possible, we do food where we have to. Wherever possible, we provide cash because it supports markets, supports local production. And of course, as soon as possible, we turn to programs that support self-reliance and really local production. So that's our approach to try to contribute. And then, of course, increasingly, we are looking at private sector. Traditionally, I think private sector has been kind of, something we do at the global level with MasterCard or whatever. That certainly continues, but we're now much more tapped into local private sector. It's impressive wherever you go. I would even say that the harder the conditions are, the stronger the entrepreneurial spirit of the private sector. And that's something for us to tap into even more.
Thank you very much, Carl. Colleagues, we're going to come to you for questions, so prepare your questions. So, Maximo, thank you very much for really a thought-provoking presentation. So I want to really dive a little bit more with you on how could we advance really global food security. So what concrete steps are needed to make food security a core pillar of global security? And how can investment in resilient food system be framed as preventive security measures alongside defense spending to reduce the risk of conflict and the risk of fragility?
No, thank you very much. So look, let me separate the questions. The first one about global food security. So the important thing that we need to observe is that we need to have a portfolio in the world of food supplies which is diversified. Why? Because climate events, climate shocks, geopolitical issues could impact the specific locations. One of the major problems structurally outside of all the consequences of the war in Ukraine is the fact that we touch a country that was a key exporter of cereals in the world. Therefore, we move backwards in terms of market concentration to what we have in 2007, 2008. That makes us more risky, because if something happens to any of these key exporting countries, which are 4 or 5, then we have a spike in prices, we have excessive volatility, and we have problems. So globally, we need to invest in big producing countries, in big exporting countries where there is a space to grow at larger scale so that we diversify the global portfolio. Second, we know that trade is a good solution to have the diversity of foods, nutritious foods that we need. For sure, in extreme situations, like it was said before, we need to help to produce for self-consumption. Let me give you a very concrete example, Afghanistan. FAO has been working with our partners, with WFP and others, to supply inputs and to supply seeds to farmers in Afghanistan, in the rural areas. And we accomplished 2 things. Despite of the crisis, we reduced acute food insecurity. And second, we also were able to empower women in rural areas, because they were part of the networks through which we distribute that. So it had an impact, a huge impact locally. But if I want to move to better diets, I need trade. And we have proof in a publication that we did that trade helps to increase availability of the multiple nutritious foods. Of course, there are cases, special cases, like seeds, small island development states, where they import almost all their food. And they, of course, are importing also super processed food that has also effects over weight and overweight. But in average, trade is good for that. That's why it's so important in terms of global food security, the importance of trade. Now, the second element of resilience, which is the second part of your question, which I think is extremely important, here, as Carl was saying, we know anticipatory action gives you 1 to 7. So every dollar I invest, $7 of return. While if I do it exposed, I am paying even more because of the expansion and the mobility and so on. We know people don't migrate because they like to migrate. People migrate because they have a problem where they are, and therefore they have to move to other locations. So we can minimize that. Just if you look at the dry corridor in El Salvador and Central America, you look from where people are migrating to the US. And they come from areas where agriculture can really make a difference, but they don't have the resources, they don't have the support, the technology. So we can bring a structural solution. So resilience has 2 components for me. One is the prevention, as I was mentioned before. That means I need to have early warning systems. Because if I want to do anticipatory action, I want to know 1 week before or 2 days before the cyclone touches, so I can distribute cash immediately for people to be ready. If I have the ENSO, the Niño, La Niña, I need to know before so I can clean the rivers to avoid the typical floodings that we have. That is having good projects to predict the shock. We need One Health because we want to avoid problems like COVID. We want to avoid transborder diseases. And we need insurance. Insurance is still super primitive. We are doing a revolution by trying to change insurance to probabilities rather than to exposed. But that is a huge change, but we don't get the support to continue doing it. That is such a contradiction. And the second component of resilience is capacity of absorption. So I know that I will have ENSO, I know I will have a drought, I know I will have a cyclone. What I do, I can do anticipatory and minimize the shock, but also need to have preventive mechanisms in place. Social protection, crucial, to have in place the structure so that I can move immediately and target. But I also need technology, innovation. That's the investment in agriculture. That's the varieties of seeds that are resistant to extreme weather, to floods. That's where I need to work to avoid diseases. So that's where we need to invest and trade, of course. So those are the 2 components of resilience, because people talk about resilience generically. But no, there is a big difference. And the ideal for us is preventive. And to invest in time, because we are affecting not only today, but the problem is tomorrow also.
Thank you very much, Maximo, and I couldn't agree more. There is the prevention, there's the absorption. And I think the absorption, I think you said it, and I want to just repeat it. Really, it's about investing in research and development, and investing in innovation and in national systems. National systems regardless if you are in a least income country, a high income country, if your national system does not have a capacity to absorb the knowledge and to scale it with their private sector through the right policies and regulation, you go nowhere. You are just fixing temporarily, but not for a long term. I want to combine two questions, one of them on the funding cuts and the security implication, and the other one on private sector role. And maybe I'll go through all of you colleagues to tell me your views on it. So how are current funding cuts to humanitarian and development programs affecting food security and effort to prevent instability? And where do you see a role for the private sector? And how do you see us really building strong partnership that will align investment with the stability goals from your perspectives as IMO, WFP, FAO? I'll start with you, Amy.
So the funding cuts are having pretty serious impact for people who are on the move. And, I'm looking over to our partners at WFP, because as their funding is cut and there is not support for communities who are already displaced, we are seeing people move a second, a third time. For example, we're looking at communities in Somalia, as Carlos pointed out, who have been very, very drought impacted. Now, one interesting thing is we'd already seen refugees from Somalia who'd been designated as refugees who found refuge in Kenya, who were then resettled and able to go home to Somalia because of greater stability, then left again because of drought. That is a blatant example of how we've wasted billions of dollars if we don't get to these underlying causes of why people move in the first place. We are now seeing, also with Somalis, onward movements in ways that we hadn't anticipated, showing up, for example, in places like Libya. We're seeing likewise Sudanese who do not have access to support in some of the neighboring countries continue onward movements. So if we pull assistance, food assistance being the most critical, basic assistance, we should expect that communities will continue to move onward. Now, there are a couple of really fantastic innovations with the private sector that I want to call out, because I do think this is part of the response. One is we're developing, some of our partners around the table are developing insurance products, recognizing that food insecurity, particularly food insecurity that's driven by extreme weather, is something that can be predicted and insured against the same way you would predict against other disasters in countries with more resources. And so looking for ways to think about how we provide this funding, finding the underwriters who will provide the basic support for these policies, having agreements with insurance companies who can provide resources in the immediate aftermath of an extreme weather event, that is a great example of how we use tools that exist out there to respond to some of these more acute circumstances.
Thank you very much, Amy. And maybe at some point, I would love somebody to explain how insurance can really de-risk the farming business, knowing that the farmers, the small-scale farmers, cannot afford it. So I would love to hear somebody explaining it. But the same question to you, Carl, and then I come to you, Maxim.
I mean, first, maybe on the funding, just to kind of give a picture. So only for WFP last year, we saw a 40% cut in our contributions, 40%. And that's at a time when we've seen the numbers from Maximo before just going up. And so demand is increasing. The operating environments for us, whether it's Sudan, Gaza, it's just more complex than it's ever been, which is also driving up costs, by the way. And then, of course, the contribution have come down. We had to let go of some 5,000 to 6,000 colleagues last year. So it's been traumatic, and certainly we are seeing not least the impact on the ground. You spoke about Afghanistan, where certainly we have kind of partnered up with FAO, trying to push back hunger through more development means. But in the meantime, people are dying of hunger. I mean, going into this winter, we were able to only support some 2 million people, where compared to last year, that was 8 to 9 million people. There is no doubt that children have died this winter due to that lack of funding. So that is real, and there is no doubt about that. I think, turning to your question around private sector, there are two parts to that. One is, of course, because, looking across, it's clear that, it's not a lack of capital in the world. We are seeing a funding shortage, but it's not like there isn't money out there. So how can we tap in to that money? Either through philanthropy, contributions directly to us, or becoming a facilitator for some of that capital to kind of deal with food security issues in the places we operate. It's hard in the most fragile places, no doubt. But even there, we have created a mechanism now to see if there are those who are, wanting to invest with high-risk capital into some of these contexts where we are uniquely placed, having been there for a long time, having relationships with private sector actors through our programs, and are happy to kind of facilitate then relationships between that capital and those actors locally. And so I think when we look at funding, it's not about coming to WFP, it's how can private capital across, help deliver on food security outcomes where we're engaged. The second part of that is how do we partner with private sector for smart solutions. So here in Munich, we have something called the Accelerator, which is an office that are looking to partner with private sector on smart solutions. And not least now in technology and AI, there are massive opportunities to make sure that not only are we more effective and efficient, but also that the quality of the support provided is much better. So there are a number of excellent examples of that and how we are not only then partnering, as I said before, with private sector at the global level, but really also at the very local level, because that's where often the creativity is even more relevant to the work that we do.
Thank you very much, Carl. And as you talk about technology and AI, and if you look at the numbers, in agriculture we are investing few $1 billion. You look at other sectors, and it's minimum 100 times more. So agriculture seems really the orphan sectors that always is the last one to take advantage of many of the technologies. So happy about your innovation center here in Munich. Maximo, the same question, please.
So let me put it this way. So our concern at FAO, of course, we are impacted by funding cuts and so on. We are lucky that we have a stable share of funding by contributions of members, but always there are challenges on those. But despite that, half of our budget is voluntary contribution. So, but what is the problem for us? The problem for us is who will be the most affected by these issues of funding. And clearly, if you look at the distribution of ODA, the continent that will be the most affected is Africa, and especially Sub-Saharan Africa. What is more wrong about it is that it's a continent which is still, hunger is increasing at a higher velocity, in difference to Latin America and in difference to Asia, some countries of Asia. Mm-hmm. So that's a big problem for us. So we have to do as much as we can to minimize that problem. And we always try to find, okay, we are in this choke of funding, how we can get an opportunity from this. And here is where the private sector, where the insurance system and all this comes into play. Why? Because our job in Africa right now is to help them to restructure how they were using their own resources. And Africa has the CARAP framework, and the Post-Malabo Declaration. They have developed a huge institutionality. And it's kind of frozen right now because of all these issues of chokes of funding. But they have to do what they call the domestication of the CARAP framework, where they are going to bring it to investment plans. And that's where we need to help. Why? Because we need them first to use their little resources in the most efficient way, working with the governments. And that's what is the repurposing agenda. Mm-hmm. And we are working with the World Bank and other banks to try to help countries to do it in the most efficient way so that the resources that they give, the support they give to agriculture, really brings the highest return to their economies. And it has to be catalytic. Second, we need to bring a portfolio of investment plans that they can get into the banks. Instead of just going into a bank and getting a loan for whatever the bank thinks should be done, they do it aligned to what is their own strategy and their own priorities. And they need to have this portfolio of investment plans which are certified, and we're working on that. And third, we need to attract private sector. This is a continent where you have the biggest level of local conflicts, a continent which have a lot of debt stress. I don't know if you know, but when you are in debt stress, nobody can help you, because IMF cannot help you, the World Bank cannot help you, IFAD cannot help you, because it affects their ratings, of course. So those are the countries which really need other types of support. That's the debt swapping, for example, the restructuring of debt, things that will help them to improve their macroeconomic situation. So that's the way we can help them to cope with this situation, which will be the most difficult. So some examples, no? We were referring of Haiti. Haiti, we have a huge problem, mostly in the urban areas. So we need to push agriculture. And in two ways we are working. One in the south, trying to promote development of agriculture in the south, where you don't have the same problem as in the city. And that we hope will pull in labor force, young people, to there so that we can stabilize a little bit the situation. And second, we know that they migrate to Dominican Republic. So one of the most important hand-in-hand projects that we have is one in the border, where basically the government provides a huge piece of land, FAO is providing technical assistance, working to create the capabilities of very good farmers, which are from Haiti, so that they can supply high-value commodities to who? To a huge resort, which is being built in the border, in the beach for the Dominican Republic. Demand is secure, you have the labor force, they need the technology, they need the quality of land, and the seeds that they need to produce high-value commodities. So those type of solutions, I think, will help in the future. The other example is how we bring the insurance tool. No? So with the G7 of Italy, we developed what we called the FAO Financing Shock-Driven Food Crisis Facility, which WFP with OCHA. The whole idea of this facility is to scale up and improve over situations that already exist. A replica for Africa is already there. But we want to move it faster. We will make it really anticipatory action. This requires several things. One, technology. It requires early warning systems. So we developed the situation room. We call it the riskmonitor.fao.org. There is where we have 12 risks right now, 6 climatic, 6 non-climatic, which include, for example, conflict. We are working with Norway on that. But also, this has to be linked, which will provide the triggers for probabilities of the event to happen, what you were saying, is linked to reinsurance. We are working with Munich Re. And Munich Re has agreed to test these insurance profiles so that we can deploy insurance in time of a probability. So when there is a high probability that an event will happen, they will trigger the insurance. And then it moves through the institutions to apply very fast and do really anticipatory action. Why so important? Because we do anticipatory action, 1 to 7, but we increase the coverage times 10. So the $1 that we had before, now it's multiplied times 10 in terms of coverage. So again, those are the types of interaction with the private sector. Now, attracting private sector to a very risky environment is not easy. It's very difficult. But there are two elements which we believe are important. One is technical de-risking, so giving them information, and two is de-risking with money. But one of the challenges that we will be facing is data. And the budget cuts is affecting data. It will affect our colleagues of WFP that supply data for measuring acute food insecurity. It affected FuseNet that supply data. Now I think is reestablished. But it affected many of the data generators in the world. And our job as FAO is to be normative in terms of data. So that data, we need to find ways, and again, we are trying to do innovation. But clearly, we need to have more investment in data because it's what brings the lights to the rooms, the lights to the targeting, the lights to decide where I put my dollar today, and not create a problem.
Otherwise, you're shooting in the dark. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Maximo. And I want to just add that AgriConnect, the new program that IFAD has joined, that the African Development, that Asian Development Bank and many development banks joined, is looking at many of the aspects that you mentioned, Maximo. We're going to open the floor for questions. So if you could please introduce yourself and pose the question either to one of the panelists or to all of them at once. Yes, please. We have so many. 1, 2, 3. So do we have mics, colleagues? Go ahead. Here we go. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning. Tomasz Lorencic, ITF Enhancing Human Security, Slovenia. We do demining in a number of countries around the world. We have, I would like to allude to what Mr. Torero mentioned in his slide concerning the pollution. You mentioned nuclear pollution, but as a matter of fact, we notice in a number of countries the use of explosive remnants of war, of mines, as a tool, as a method in order to deny these areas for food production, for food security, in a way which almost looks systemic. We see it in Fertile Crescent in Syria, in northeast Syria. We see it in Iraq, next to Shat el Arab. That was the biggest palm forest in the world, I think, completely devastated. We see it in southern Lebanon, a very fertile region, and of course now with Ukraine, where it is to the 10th power. How do you see this this problem, how to address this pollution by explosive remnants of war. Ukrainian farmers are going to go out on the 4th anniversary of the beginning of war for the 4th time. The number of accidents with tractors going out to field jumps exponentially. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Maximo, if you can.
Very briefly, is something that we are working together with other agencies in Ukraine, especially. So farmers are heroes, no? They are taking huge risks to cope with this. But I think it's something we need to look carefully.
No, and maybe just to add to that, I mean, specifically the program that we're doing together with FAO and a Swiss demining agency in Ukraine is something called Survey and Release, where we are, huge landmass have been closed off in eastern Ukraine. And what we're doing is we're providing a technology with drones where you can quickly then survey what is actually contaminated in those areas and then really close those off. And that has proven very effective because often it's between 3 and 5% that maybe is actually contaminated. And if we can then encircle and close that off, because that will take 10, 20 years maybe to demine later, but that farmers then can come back on the rest of the land. And this has been a hugely impactful program working together with FAO and in Ukraine.
Only one last thing, if I can. So
yes.
There is a huge work on assessments, not done by GeoGlam and NASA and so on. And it's incredible to see that despite of the mines being present, and you see, because you can see in the close satellite photographs, how farmers build up again and continue to grow. No? So that is shocking.
And maybe to add, just in Gaza, for example, on the contamination of land, we're working with the Saudis and a few other donors to look at technologies to produce off-land, because again, decontamination is very costly, and we don't have the funding for it, and it takes time. So just to add to what Maximo and Carl. So we have a question here, please.
I thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here at the conference, and I would like just to shoot my question directly to the CEO of the WFP.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Bedreddin Ali. I'm an ambassador and an advisor to the Prime Minister of Sudan on diplomatic affairs. So my question is, I was shocked by making a general accusations of using food as a weapons in Sudan without, it's not good for that without mentioning that the militia, which must be named and designated as terrorist organizations which use weapons, which use food as weapons. For us, let me just reaffirm our commitments as the governments to the principle of international humanitarian law and deny at the same time any kinds of allegations and accusations of using food as a weapons from the WFP CO. Let me also ensure that the delivery of the humanitarian aids for us as a government, the situations for us is very clear for all of the organizations right now. And let us also to cooperate and to increase the dialogue and emphasize the dialogue for with international corporations, so as just to mention the best ways and to ensure the relations between all our organizations. For us also, we are providing supports for all the organizations for the access. Sudan is the only or the second country over the globe which opened its borders from a country which helped the militia from Chad, namely 9 to 10 points for the access. So for us as a government, it is not accept that's to mention that the governments or any entities inside the Sudan belong to the governments or any departments of concerns which use food as a weapons. It is better for all of us just to nominate or to finger which organizations or which the militia directly is using food as a weapons. I thank you.
I want to come because I think there must have been a misunderstanding, Ambassador. I spoke about the besiegement of El Fasher and the besiegement of Kadugli, and we all know who's responsible for that besiegement. As soon as the besiegement in Kadugli had been lifted by efforts of the government over the past 2 weeks. We have now been able to deliver food to Kadugli. We're working closely with authorities, with HAC, in pushing access in areas where it's possible. In Khartoum now, we are up and running full scale and looking at how we can also extend air services into Khartoum. So I think there must have been a misunderstanding here. I spoke clearly about 2 areas where we are very much aligned on what is needed and who is responsible.
Thank you so much. We have 2 more questions, the lady in orange and Bram in the front here. Yes.
Thank you very much. So my name is Marta Zuluaga. I work for Cargill, so a food and agriculture company. And I'd like to ask a question, to Maximum, following up a bit from your presentation, Maximum. You said geopolitics is reshaping trade and pushing from just in time to just in case. And so from a food security perspective, what I was wanting to see is what do you see as the main consequences of this shift, both for prices, access, and resilience, and where do you think this new trade paradigm is heading to? So basically, is it a response to shocks, or are we looking into a permanent restructuring of global food trade? Thanks.
No, very, very quickly. So when I say just in case, for me, is we are no longer using necessarily comparative advantages, which is the core behind trade. No, I move commodities because my climate, my area is better to produce something than another country that can produce something else for which they can be better and have a better comparative advantage. But they have one more variable now in their minds, which is I need to be careful because that trade connection could be switched off because of logistics or because of a blockage of mobility of food. In that case, I have to diversify my portfolio to be more risk averse. I need to protect under risks. So basically what I see is that the world is working under risks and uncertainties, and therefore it's just in case. Inefficiencies, it could cost more and it won't be optimal, which is the last thing we need today where the resources are so scarce. Now, how the trade will evolve, we don't know. No? It's very difficult to track what is happening today because there are things happening in public, there are things not necessarily happening in public. But we are trying to model every day what is moving. Our hope is that we will stabilize at some point. But for sure, instead, as I was saying before, of having one big spaghetti ball where multilateral trade and bilateral trade were combined to gain these efficiencies, that is being segmented now, no? And the trade is starting to split. And now, for example, if we look at how the mobility of food is happening in the world, we are looking that we are in a second-best equilibrium, which is at a higher cost, no? Because they are taking routes to protect themselves of these issues, which are not the most efficient ones, but at the same time, they are being more resilient. So everything has a benefit and a cost. As I said today, in terms of logistics and risk, and you know better than me, today, if I close the Panama Canal, for example, the risk is very low. One country will be affected, majorly, in terms of efficiency. But we already have alternative routes. But that means that we are at a higher cost where I become less sensible to these shocks. But it's at a higher cost. And who that affects? The countries which are food import dependent. No? So that's the situation we are evolving. Let's hope we arrive to a better equilibrium, a Pareto optimum, as we say, so that we can be better. No?
Yeah, if I can add, and that's where diversification, that it's very important. And that's where we see still many countries are still producing like if we are still in the colonial time. Yeah. And that's completely wrong. You should stop the things that you used to do and say we do it because that's what the farmers know. No, you should have your own national system. You produce what you can, what your ecosystem can produce. You could use technology. In Africa, most of the productivity could be multiplied by 5, 7 very easily. And it could be multiplied by 10 with much more bigger investments. So I think it's very important to go back to that diversification and what landscape should be producing. Bram? And introduce yourself.
Good morning, my name is Bram Kovacs. I'm the Director General of CIMIT. I'm proud of being the director of an organization created in 1943 to use science and innovation for food security, but also as that diplomacy 1.5 and 2.0 space. And I'm very happy that there's, I think, up to 12 events in the Munich Security Conference around food security. At the same time, I'm a bit concerned. So a question for the colleagues from World Food Programme and FAO. We were members for 2 years now, working in the food security task force of the Munich Security Conference. Just a couple of hours ago, we launched the joint statement. So the topic is on the agenda. At the same time, I think in other rooms, I am not sure how much the topic actually is on the agenda. Is the bandwidth there, on the one hand, to absorb this? On the other hand, are we using the right language, the right concepts, the right frameworks to turn this into action within the security space?
So I'll give you the choice, 3 of you. I think it's a question that could apply to you as well, Amy. So what do you think? What do we need to do more? Are we really on the agenda, or aren't we yet? So whomever want to start. Yeah, Amy, yeah.
Well, I'll say, quite frankly, that I don't think it's sufficiently on the agenda. And this really comes down to looking at how governments are choosing to spend their money. And we're seeing it because we're on the front lines. We are seeing the consequence of governments choosing to fund defense over development assistance or over humanitarian assistance. And what we know is that then, from my point of view, that leads to the movement of people, that leads to more conflict, that leads to greater regional instability, that ultimately leads to the need for greater defense, right? So we're having a one-sided conversation and failing to address the drivers of that conversation. If I could just put one more plug in before we leave, because I want to underscore the criticality of data. We tend to treat food insecurity as an emergency over and over and over and over again. It costs billions of dollars when we respond to emergencies. If we are to do what has been very sensibly put out here, which is to invest in data so we can identify communities that are at risk of food insecurity as a result of drought, as a result of land degradation or flooding, et cetera, if we are to come up with more sustainable ways of agriculture, if we're to invest in new ways of farming, particularly in countries across Africa where we have high numbers of young people without jobs for the future, that is the way that we actually can create greater regional stability, greater global stability, and ultimately lead to less of a need for all the defense spending that is on the table here. So,
thank you very much, Amy. And if you could do the same, reply and give one key message that you want people to.
First of all, I want to enormously thank the Order of Malta, because they allowed me to present without even looking at what I was going to present, which is amazing. Second, I think as a developing country, I used to self-inflict myself. So I don't want to blame anybody for this not being fully in the agenda. I think it's part of our fault, because I think we are more worried on we have less money, we need more money, than we are worried of making the business case of why this is so important. And the reason why we did these scenarios was to show that this is not just for us to get more money. This is because it's a huge investment that has a huge return of security, which could scale up enormously the resources that you have. So this 1.5% that you have from the 5% for resilience, the best investment is to do this type of resilience, because that will pay you back enormously. So that's what is our job, to bring evidence so that can be used correctly. And just the message is, let's not forget that what we want is good food for all for today and tomorrow. So anything we do today will impact it tomorrow, no matter what. So we need to be very careful in assessing our decisions and our processes.
Thank you, Maximo. Carl?
No, but I think on the attention, I commented on that. I think, having seen over the past couple of years, attention really going down in terms of what, has been described as more soft elements of security and up on the hard. I think, we really want to, again, reverse that, but more importantly, that the investments also follow in that. The same on data. I completely agree with colleagues on the data, but it's not only having the picture, it's also then taking action on that picture. And frankly, on Somalia, we do have the picture, but we are not taking the action necessary. I think, if there's one message, I think, if it isn't that European capitals are paying enough attention, certainly affected countries are paying attention. Sudan, Somalia, Haiti. And so to bring in those voices more at the center of this conversation, I think is, the way forward. And also institutions that maybe are closer to the impacted people and countries, like the African Unions and others, where we know that this agenda is really at the center.
Thank you very much, Carl. Thank you, Maximo. Thank you, Amy. We are coming to an end of this event. So let me really thank wholeheartedly the Order of Malta and the Munich Security Conference for bringing us together. I think maybe we are not yet fully on the agenda. You heard the answer from the colleague. I could add really that we need to have people in the room that are from the other sectors. So we don't have anybody from defense right here. We don't have much people from the energy. We don't have enough people from logistics. So there are many sectors where there is much more, and tech as well. So I think really we need to talk to the non-converters, so to non-convertees. So we need to talk to people that are not from the sector to get there. So what I heard today myself, it's really that there is a clear link between food security and security at large, national and international and global. Food security is fundamental to national security and global. As the EMD of CGR, and as we are on the ground in so many countries, we see every day how climate risk, how conflict dynamics, how pressure on food system are deeply interconnected. Addressing these challenges requires integrated, anticipatory, and local-driven innovation at scale. We're very happy with piloting, but we need scale. And that's where private sector is needed, that's where investment is needed, that's where philanthropy is very much needed. So we do need a lot of innovation, and we need to scale it. We need also rule of law. We can't keep fixing issues that are due to different groups or countries not following the rule of law. So without sustained investment, hunger and food insecurity will continue to rise, with serious consequences for peace, stability, and security at both national and global levels. As I said earlier, for me, conflict fuel hunger, hunger fuel conflict, it's really a detrimental relationship that we need to break. This is why investment in international development, in agricultural innovation, should be viewed as core component of defense and security financing. Preventing crises is far more effective than responding to them. I want to leave you with some of the messages that I heard today that really I think are very important for all of us to take home. A world that cannot feed itself is a world that can never be safe. We must recognize that food security and peace building are two sides of the same coin. So if we agree on that, I think we need to call upon so many sectors to come and discuss with us, not only us between each other, because we have been working for a very long time, but we haven't yet had really that piercing through that wall that is around food security. So my call is on faith keepers, wherever they are, on the fence, to look at it really as food security is part and parcel of global security and need to be addressed. And unless we invest, nothing come out. Look at technology. All the investment, trillions of dollars go into technology because people know that's where it's a very high return on investment. It's mostly private sector funding. But as public sector, we need also to do that investment in areas like agriculture, like innovation, because that's what's going to save the life of people. Thank you so much, and thank you again to Order of Malta.
In conclusion, and on behalf of the Sovereign Order of Malta, we warmly wish to thank all speakers for your precious contribution and all participants for attending and listening to this extremely interesting and in-depth side event co-organized with the Munich Security Conference on Global Food Security. Thank you so much.